think of ourselves as the most powerful beings in the universe, it's unsettling to discover that we're wrong. Time has come to see the world as it is.
Can we pull back the veil of static and reach into the source of all being? Behind this curtain lies this random pattern generator. You will be responsible for an escalation that will destroy everything.
Hello and welcome. In the previous episode, I talked about how the etheric plane is like a mirror of the physical world. Well, it would actually be a bit more accurate to say that what human people have generally experienced beyond death as a mirror of the physical world, or as another state of being overlapping and corresponding with the physical world, is one of the etheric planes. My spirits tell me that there are actually different places or phases of what is called the etheric plane. Some could be said to not belong to humans, but are the realms of other intelligent beings who could be said to dwell next to us in space-time, in a way. Now, I don't want to get too pedantic here, or ramble on and on too much about minute details, because matters of what we call the spirit worlds have a near irreducible complexity. I would, though, like to mention some interesting things the spirits have told me about the etheric state of being, much of which I have since read about or heard mentioned by other people. Many of the apparitions which people see in graveyards are actually, well, the dead bodies of ghosts, basically. Once a human person dies and then perceives the world in the etheric state, they eventually move on to other states of being, the major one being what is called the astral planes in the West. When they move on, they leave their etheric body behind, just as their etheric body left their physical body behind. This body doesn't collapse to the ground like a dead physical body, but can often just be left standing, looking like someone who is dazed or in a trance. Now, since the etheric body is tied to the physical body, people of a less spiritually aware nature will often, in their etheric state, be around their dead physical body in a sort of a daze. When they move on from that state, they leave the etheric body behind, which is left standing there until it is broken down by etheric life forms, just as the dead physical body is broken down by animals like carrion-eating birds, insects, and microorganisms in this world. These etheric animals, which break down etheric matter, are referred to by some as parasites or by others as larvae. In form, they tend to resemble centipedes or worms, complete with hooked barbs and other similar limbs which work well to anchor them into or onto other etheric life forms. Now, as I've had many experiences with them over the years, I'll be bringing up these etheric parasite beings quite a lot as I do this show. Alright, and now the news.
What the hell in God's name is going down here?
And now for some strange events from the Northern Territory of Australia. At Corroboree Rock, near Alice Springs, a Reverend R.S. Blanc, visiting this Aboriginal ritual site, took a photograph on which a strange figure appeared in 1959. In Darwin, a long-necked sea monster, more than 75 feet long, was seen by policemen fishing in Bino Harbor, February 1980. In Killarney Station, 3 rains of fish in a fortnight on cattle farms, 200 miles from the sea, February 1974. At Melville Island, sea monster seen about 5 miles southeast of Island, at least 40 feet long with huge head, which witness in boat tried to hit with an oar. June 1916. At Wave Hill Station, hundreds of fishes fell from the sky in 1951 or 1952. At Wirion River, nursing sister traveled into a remote area to help man who had been shot in the leg. While she was attending to the wound, 2 men appeared wearing white operating theater gowns and helped her. When she looked up to thank them, they had gone. Several Aborigines witnessed this event in February 1941. Now, Queensland in Australia. At Bougainville Reef, pilot photographed UFO which paced his plane 28 May 1965. Boulia in Winton, occasional appearances of the Min Min light, oval and luminous, moving irregularly close to the ground or higher. In Cairns, in City Street, crocodile locked jaws round man's leg. He kicked it away and it dived into a storm drain. May 1983. In Cunnamulla, delta-winged aircraft with no tail, windows, or sound zigzagged over golfers and trail bike riders. RAAF claimed no known delta-wing aircraft in that area, late September 1984. In Emerald, a man-beast, or Yowie, which left footprints 12 inches long, pursued witness and bounced his car up and down in August 1979. At Eton Range near McKay, 3 men saw a circular UFO 30 feet in diameter, which made a buzzing noise. It carried another disc and had tripod landing gear and headlights. Damaged trees and landing traces found by police, 23rd May 1965. At Fraser Island, long black objects up to 100 feet long seen floating in the sea. The 6th of June 1965. Other sightings of USOs that year off Kulam and Mululaba. Yeah, that's it, Mululaba. The USO is an unidentified submarine object, by the way. At Horseshoe Lagoon near Tully, a man driving tractor saw a blue-gray UFO 24 feet in diameter rise from lagoon, spinning like a top, and fly off fast. Flattened reeds found, 19th January 1966. Near Kilcoy, 2 teenagers camping in gully caught glimpse of Yowie and found large footprints in soft sand, February 1980. At Laidley, Toowoomba District, falls of crabs and rain, 50 miles from sea, 12th May 1930. At Maryborough-Moreton Bay, no, that's what it says. I don't know what that means, but that's what it says. Sea monster sightings along coastline since late last century. Near Nambour, boys saw a tiny disc, about 12 inches in diameter, hovering close by. It made a humming noise and had whitish mist around it. Afterwards, he felt ill and developed large blisters on his hands in 1932 or 1933. Near Nebo, a group of young people saw strange lights and objects in trees, heard loud explosion. In following days, unusual marks found on the ground, 22nd March 1975. At Prince of Wales Island, hunters saw red UFO land, others saw similar object, July 14th, 1959. At Springbrook, Gold Coast, man cutting timber saw a 7-foot Yowie, 1978. Mount Tambourine, Gold Coast, hinterland, 3 horsemen were stalked by a Yowie on mountain slopes. It was large and gray and scared the cattle dogs, May 1981. At Townsville, sea monster with 3 humps covered with scales and barnacles seen by fishermen beyond Fairway Beacon, other sightings off Moreland Harbor and McKay, August and September 1934. At Warwick, fall of gudgeon from the sky, 1901. Other fishfall locations in the state include Cooper's Plains, 1906, Victoria Park, Brisbane, 1907, Caloundra, February 1909, Ipswich District, 12th May, 1930, Near Prairie, February 1944, Cloncurry, 6th February 1949, Townsville Airport, 1st April 1959, Brisbane Suburbs, 1959, and Hughenden, 16th April 1971. Now we move to Michigan, in the United States, at Williamston. On April 17th, 1897, in the morning, at least a dozen farmers saw an object maneuver in the sky for an hour before it landed. A strange man, near 3 meters tall, almost naked and suffering from the heat, was the pilot of the craft. Quote, his talk, while musical, seemed to be a repetition of bellowings, end quote. One farmer went near him and received a blow that broke his hip. In Leroy, Kansas, on April 19th, 1897, at 22:30 hours, Alexander Hamilton was awakened by a noise among the cattle and went out with his son and his tenant. They saw an elongated cigar-shaped object about 100 meters long with a transparent cabin underneath showing narrow reddish bands hovering 10 meters above ground. They approached within 15 meters of it. It was illuminated and equipped with a searchlight. Inside it were, quote, 6 of the strangest beings, end quote, the witness had seen, also described as hideous. They spoke a language no witness could understand. A cow was dragged away by the object with the help of a long red cable. It was found butchered in a field the next day. In Arkansas, on April 20th, 1897, 1800 hours, Captain James Hooton was hunting in the vicinity of Homon when he heard the noise of a steam engine and found an object in a clearing. It looked like a cylinder with pointed ends, lateral wheels, and horizontal blades over it. Hooton spoke with a man who wore dark glasses and walked behind the craft. There were 3 or 4 occupants. The witness was told this was indeed the airship, and that it used compressed air for propulsion. Hooton saw the wheels spin as the craft rose and flew away. In Rockland, Texas, on April 22nd, 1897, at 23:30 hours, John M. Barkley was intrigued when his dog barked furiously and a high-pitched noise was heard. He went out, saw a flying object circling 5 meters above ground. Elongated with protrusions and blinding lights, it went dark when it landed. Barkley was met by a man who told him his purpose was peaceful and requested some common hardware items to repair the craft. He paid with a $10 bill and took off, quote, like a bullet out of a gun. In Jocelyn, Texas, on April 22nd, 1897, at 2400 hours, Frank Nichols, who lived 3 kilometers east of Jocelyn and was one of its most respected citizens, was awakened by a heavy machine noise. Looking outside, he saw a heavy lighted object land in his wheat field. He walked toward it, but was stopped by 2 men who asked permission to draw water from his well. He then had a discussion with a half-dozen men, the crew of the strange machine. He was told how it worked, but could not follow the explanation. In McKinney Bayou in Arkansas, April 23, 1897, Judge Lawrence A. Byrne of Texarkana, Arkansas, was surveying a tract of land when he saw a peculiar object anchored on the ground. Quote, It was manned by 3 men who spoke a foreign language, but judging from their looks, one would take them to be Japs, end quote. Ouch. All right. Well, anyway, that's there. Apologies to all the Japanese listeners out there. All right. At Merkel, Texas, April 25th, 1897, in the evening, people returning from church observed a heavy object being dragged along the ground by a rope attached to a flying craft. The rope got caught in a railroad track. The craft was too high for its structure to be visible, but protrusions and a light could be distinguished. After about 10 minutes, a man came down along the rope, cut the end free, and went back aboard the craft, which flew away toward the northeast. The man was small and dressed in a light blue uniform. Oh, I might add to this one, I remember reading about this one before, and another detail is that as he pulled himself down and up on the rope, it appeared as if he was underwater. At Keela, Hillsborough, Texas, on April 26, 1897, approximate date, a lawyer was surprised to see a lighted object fly over. His horse was scared and nearly toppled the carriage. When the main light was turned off, a number of smaller lights became visible on the underside of the dark object, which supported an elongated canopy. It went down toward a hill to the south, 5 kilometers from Aquila. When the witness was on his way back 1 hour later, he saw the object rising. It reached the altitude of the cloud ceiling and flew to the northeast at a fantastic speed with periodic flashes of light. In the summer of 1875, at Crogland Hall, an estate in Cumberland, England, Miss Amelia Cranswell was awake in bed when an eerie skeleton-like figure broke open her window and barged into her boudoir. Her screams alerted her 2 brothers, Edward and Michael, who broke down the locked door to reach her. They found her unconscious with blood pouring from wounds in her throat and shoulders. They saw the figure loping across the lawn outside and pursued it, but it got away. Other women in the neighborhood reported similar attacks by a grisly bony apparition. A senseless wave of sheep killings also took place in Cumberland County and was repeated throughout England years later. In December 1967, in Ohio, a cow was sliced neatly in half as if by a giant pair of scissors. Numerous dogs had been found with their blood gone and no trace of injury on their corpses. And here's a greater elaboration of one I had mentioned earlier in this segment. On April 16, 1897, the Saginaw, Michigan Courier-Herald reported that at 4:30 a.m. on Wednesday morning, April 14th, a strange flying contraption landed in a field near Howard City, Michigan, and a naked giant stepped from it. Quote, "He is about 9.5 feet tall," the report stated, quote, "and his talk, while musical, is not talk at all, but seems to be a repetition of bellowing. One of the farmers, who was somewhat braver, attempted to go near him and got a kick that will last him for some time, having got his hip broken. Great excitement prevails here, and lots of people are flocking here from Morley and Howard City to view the strange being at a distance, as no one dares to go near. He seems to be trying to talk to people." There were no follow-up stories on this alleged incident. On November 22nd, 1966, at Roaring River, Missouri, a UFO was seen and photographed by 2 hunters while they were out on a trip trying their luck deer hunting. As one of the men was returning to the place where they'd pitched their tent, he became alarmed when he saw smoke clearly rising from their camp. Running to discover what had happened, he found their large tent and other equipment almost totally destroyed and the debris, including shoes and records, still smoldering. Bizarrely, while one of the aluminum poles that supported the tent was singed but not burned, the aluminum cots inside their tent had been completely melted. Becoming aware of a humming sound, the bemused man looked up to see a strange object rising in the air from a valley below. He managed to grab his camera and took 2 photographs. In Scientific American, numbered 45-337, there was a fall of a substance described as cobwebs in the later part of October 1881 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and other towns. Other towns mentioned are Green Bay, Vestburg, Fort Howard, Sheboygan, and Ozauki. Of the substance that fell in Wisconsin, it is said, quote, "In all instances, the webs were strong in texture and very white," end quote. The editor says, quote, "Curiously enough, there is no mention in any of the reports that we have seen of the presence of spiders," end quote. So the monthly weather review, number 26-566, quotes the Montgomery, Alabama Advisor, saying that upon November 21st, 1898, numerous batches of spider web-like substance fell in Montgomery, in strands and in occasional masses, several inches long and several inches broad. According to the writer, it was not spider's web, but something like asbestos. Also that it was phosphorescent. In La Nature, 1883-342, a correspondent writes that he sends a sample of a substance said to have fallen at Montauson, October 16, 1883. According to a witness quoted by the correspondent, a thick cloud accompanied by rain and a violent wind had appeared. This cloud was composed of a woolly substance in lumps the size of a fist, which fell to the ground. The editor, Mr. Tissandier, says of this substance that it was white, but was something that had been burned. It was fibrous. Mtissandier astonishes us by saying that he cannot identify this substance. He can only say that the cloud in question must have been an extraordinary conglomeration. The Annual Register, number 1832-447, says that in March 1832 there fell, in the fields of Koreanov, Russia, a combustible yellowish substance covering, at least 2 inches thick, an area of 600-700 square feet. It was resinous and yellowish, so one inclines to the conventional explanation that it was pollen from pine trees, but when torn, it had the tenacity of cotton. When placed in water, it had the consistency of resin. Quote, "This resin had the color of amber, was elastic like India rubber, and smelled like prepared oil mixed with wax," end quote. And Philosophical Transactions, number 19-224, is an extract from a letter by Mr. Robert Vans of Kilkenny, Ireland, dated November 15, 1695, that there had been of late in the countries of Limerick and Tipperary showers of a sort of matter like butter or grease, having a very stinking smell. There follows an extract from a letter by the Bishop of Cloyne upon, quote, "a very odd phenomenon," end quote, which was observed in Munster in Leinster, that for a good part of the spring of 1695 there fell a substance which the country people called butter, quote, "soft, clammy, and of a dark yellow," end quote, that cattle fed indifferently in fields where the substance lay. Quote, "It fell in lumps as big as the end of one's finger," end quote. "It had a strong ill scent. His Grace calls it a stinking dew." In Mr. Van's letter it is said that the butter was supposed to have medicinal properties and was gathered in pots and other vessels by some of the inhabitants of this place. In January 1973, while sailing toward the Fijian Islands from Australia, the 1,483-ton sea vessel Coranda encountered some very turbulent waves. While navigating through them, the front portion of the ship dipped down into the water and seemed to collide with something beneath the surface. When the ship's bow re-emerged, the crew was horrified to perceive a colossal jellyfish weighing at least 20 tons draped all over the entire forecastle head. Clearly the object into which the Coranda had collided, this monstrous animated glob, began thrashing its enormously long tentacles across the deck. To the terrified eyewitnesses, it must have resembled a hideous disembodied Gorgon's head, with countless serpents for hair lashing out venomously in all directions. One unfortunate crew member came within range of these deadly tentacles, which instantly adhered to his skin. He was pulled clear by the other seamen on board, but the tentacles had seared into his flesh so severely that, according to one eyewitness, he looked as if he had been scalded by steam. As if the danger posed by this creature's tentacles was not enough, an additional threat was conferred by virtue of its colossal bulk, which seemed likely to send the Coranda plunging down to the sea bottom. According to the Coranda's captain, Langley Smith, the deck was awash in a 2-foot-deep tentacle mass of tentacular slime, and some of the tentacles themselves were estimated to be at least 200 feet long. Frantically, the crew did their best to clear the deck of this gelatinous horror, but its formidable stinging capability deterred every attempt made. If they needed any further proof of its deadly potency, the seaman who had been stung earlier had by now died from his injuries. This frightening episode could well have ended in even greater tragedy, but happily an SOS put out by the Coranda was detected by the Hercules, a deep-sea salvage tug 500 miles away, which set out at once to offer whatever assistance it could. The dreadful sight of this stupendous jellyfish enveloping a sizable portion of the Coranda met the near unbelieving eyes of the Hercules crew when they drew near. But with the aid of 2 high-pressure hoses spraying steam directly at the creature, it was eventually dislodged. Following the Coranda's arrival back in Sydney, samples of the jellyfish's gelatinous slime were formally analyzed, and the specimen from which they were derived was tentatively identified as a lion's mane, but one of incomparably huge proportions. In what must surely be the most controversial giant jellyfish case on file featured one such monster's supposed engulfing of the 2 children and wife of French fisherman Henri Baissel, while they were swimming with him in the sea near Bordeaux during the late 1980s. Not too surprisingly, Baissel's account of a huge jellyfish the size of a car that swallowed up his family before sinking out of sight failed to prevent the local police from arresting him on a murder charge, but he passed a lie detector test and refused to change his story. So far, the jellyfishes reported have been fairly typical in shape, if not in size, but there is one very macabre mystery beast on record that may well be a scientifically unknown representative of one of their more specialized deepwater forms. This is a singularly eerie creature spied in 1953 by an Australian diver while testing a new type of deep-sea diving suit in the South Pacific. As revealed by Eric Frank Russell in his book Great World Mysteries, 1957, the diver had been following a shark and was resting on the edge of a chasm leading down to much deeper depths. He was still watching the shark when an immense, dull brown, shapeless mass rose up out of the chasm, pulsating sluggishly and flat in general outline with ragged edges. Despite appearing devoid of eyes or other instantly recognizable sensory organs, this malign presence evidently discerned the shark's presence somehow, because it floated upwards until its upper surface made direct contact. The shark instantly gave a convulsive shudder, and was then drawn without resistance into the hideous monster's body. After that, The creature sank back down into the chasm, leaving behind a very frightened diver to ponder what might have happened if that nightmarish, nameless entity had not been attracted to the shark. On May 15th, 1951, in Salzburg, Austria, leaving work at 11 o'clock p.m., a soldier with the U.S. Army Occupation Forces in Austria was walking home when a strange being stepped from behind the bushes and paralyzed him with a pencil-shaped device that made a clicking sound. The entity, who was shorter than the soldier, had white skin and wore a dull silvery suit with a transparent helmet. The being's torso was shaped like a tin can, his legs were proportionate, but his arms were shorter than a human's and ended in 3 long fingers. His large-skulled head was cylindrical, hairless, and featured a very high forehead. The eyes were large and compound like those of a fly, while the ears and nose were just holes and the mouth a mere slit. The entity then strapped a square black plate across the soldier's chest, which made him light and enabled the humanoid to pull him effortlessly to a large landed craft, a round object 150 feet in diameter in a nearby field. The soldier was floated to the top of the craft where a door opened and they entered the dark interior. Since the craft's walls were transparent, the soldier was able to see the stars once the craft took off. They passed the moon and flew onto a planet the soldier assumed was Mars. There the craft landed on a platform above a field that was occupied by many other saucer-shaped vehicles. As the humanoid got out and floated to the ground, the soldier noticed some similar beings about, and 2 craft containing human beings who did not acknowledge his presence. When the entity returned, they took off and returned to Earth. The soldier was taken out the same way he had been brought in, using the pencil-shaped device and square black plate. The being then clicked the device at the soldier, removed the plate from his chest, and departed in his craft. The soldier rushed home and noticed he had been gone 1 hour. In December of 1957, the soldier, seeking to unburden himself of the haunting experience, walked into the offices of The Citizen, a Prince George, British Columbia newspaper, and related the details to a newsman. The newsman, who found the soldier forthright, even tried a few trick questions but failed to elicit any contradictions in the soldier's story. The being he encountered and the otherworldly trip the soldier experienced are startlingly similar to accounts that would attain prominence more than a decade later. At Fougueres-sous-Bièvre, in France, beginning in December 1913, strange noises were disturbing not only the Huguet-Prousteau family but the neighboring houses too. One evening the noise was so great that it was heard distinctly not only in the neighboring houses, but across the road, over 16 yards away. The house was shaken from top to bottom, the partitions vibrated violently, the doors and windows rattled with singular vehemence. It was found necessary to open them for fear of their glass being broken. According to reliable witnesses, the noises accompanying the vibrations of the house resembled the reverberations of distant thunder. On the other hand, the curtains of the bed were in constant agitation, as if moved by a strong draft, though everything was shut. Inside the house, several people unconnected with the family made some experiments. They struck a definite number of blows on the wall. Immediately a similar number would answer, but with peculiar sonorousness. The noises were loud and muffled and seemed to emanate from the whole house. One night some determined men went up to the garret. They had hardly got there when the noise commenced and the house began to tremble. Their lights were nearly extinguished and the men hurried down again. In a more recent case, at Pinetown, Natal, South Africa, on New Year's Day, 1984, 14-year-old Wendy Roos heard a loud noise. Quote, "I thought the house was caving in. It sounded as if a large boulder had crashed onto the roof." End quote. Nothing was found, nor was any damage done during other poltergeist disturbances before and after this event. Mysterious bangings in the house structure are annoying enough, but it can be equally nerve-wracking to lie in bed at night listening to noises below and suspecting you have intruders bent on all-out destruction. A Boer family living in Boshoff, South Africa in 1901 were woken at midnight by the sound of pots and pans being thrown around in the kitchen and dishes being smashed. After a couple of minutes all was quiet again, and in the morning they were surprised to find nothing broken and everything in place. This happened for 3 nights, more severe each time, and with the noise of furniture being overturned and broken, but nothing was ever harmed. This is not always the case, however. Poltergeists are usually destructive and household goods do get smashed and furniture broken. A destructive poltergeist outbreak was reported from Ireland in 1916, the victims being a farmer and his family. The farmer told a sergeant of the Royal Irish Constabulary, "Sergeant, I am in great trouble. I came to town today to arrange for the funeral of my youngest child. I am suffering terrible annoyance in my house night and day for almost a week. Some unseen spirit is wrecking my house, throwing cooking utensils about and breaking delf. It flung a bottle of ink over my dying child, hurled a heavy glass salt cellar at a mirror in the sick room, and broke a valuable tea set of old china that my wife was carrying downstairs for safety. She was about halfway down the stairs with the china in her apron when the whole lot was completely smashed in my presence, as well as in that of a few friends who had come to the wake. The day previous to the death of the child, myself and servants were churning in the kitchen when the butter was taken from the churn and some of it thrown against the ceiling 10 feet high. I found some of the broken china in my beer, some 30 yards distant. The sergeant went to visit the farm, having a certain degree of natural suspicion about the reported events. He sat in the kitchen with a farmer, his wife, and daughter and waited for some convincing activity on the part of the poltergeist. Quote, "Being an old warrior, I was still unsatisfied with what I saw, and I came to the conclusion in my own mind that if some one of the 7 or 8 flitches of bacon that were suspended near the ceiling, or if one of the 2 horse collars, which were hanging on pins on the wall over the fireplace, should be thrown down, I should then be satisfied as to the reality of the spook. But I took care not to betray what was passing in my mind, either by look or otherwise, to anybody that were present. I stood up to go. The woman and children said they would not remain when I left, so they started for the back door. The servant first, followed by the 2 children, then the farmer's wife, next the farmer, and I bringing up the rear. I got across the kitchen near the end of the obstructing wall, and was turning into the passage, but still in full view of the kitchen, when suddenly one of the horse collars was flung from its position, high up on the wall, the whole length of the room, landing on the floor with a smack. The farmer turned, and after we had both examined the collar, he said, 'You must now believe,' to which I assented. We passed into the yard, going towards the road, when a grape or dung fork was thrown across the yard by unseen hands.
That was a public service announcement designed to scare the shit out.
Now, something else which I should mention about the etheric body is that it is not something you get when you die, it is something which you already have. In other words, your quote-unquote ghost body is coexisting right now with your physical body. Upon death, consciousness just switches its focus from perceiving reality via the physical brain and body to perceiving reality via the duplicate etheric body. Now, at the risk of possibly being too pedantic, I should mention that this isn't necessarily everyone's experience, but it is the case for most people when they die. When I ask my spirits why etheric bodies, ghosts, have clothes and are not naked, they say that your clothes, when you have them on, are very much a part of who you are, so the etheric body follows suit. Now to bring up something which everyone knows about. Hauntings. Spooky hauntings. Well, from what I've researched and experienced, and from what the spirits have told me, the many occurrences which people have referred to as hauntings can actually be blamed on many different things. Some of the instances when people have complained about feeling uncomfortable and scared in a certain room or building can actually be attributed to a mundane electromagnetic source. For example, an electric transformer which is causing a negative reaction in the brains of some of the people who get near it. Many of the times when people see an apparition or hear screaming or a fight in an empty room, what is actually happening is what investigators refer to as a replay. Moments of intense violence and negative emotion leave an imprint on space-time, or our perception of it, to be more accurate. The sounds are not coming from a living being, and the apparition is not a consciously aware spirit. They're more like holographic replays of physical events. Now, my brother went to West Point Military Academy, and an apparition which many people are reported seeing in one of the officers' houses there was a woman running through a hall carrying a baby. The strange thing about the apparition was that her body, from about her knees down, was below the floor of the hall. It turns out that the house had burned down years ago, and was rebuilt with the floor a bit higher from where it was before the house burned down. The maid in the house had also managed to rescue a baby from the flames. But you have to wonder about what would happen with replays if they were caused by powerfully positive emotional events, instead of negative ones. Well, hospitals will be plagued with the apparitions of happy new parents beaming over their spectral babies. Unfortunate tenants in motels and hotels everywhere would be repeatedly awoken to the sounds of rough sex and visions of naked phantoms mounting each other. Theaters would be put out of business due to ghostly applause and laughter happening at all the wrong times during shows. Well, anyway, there are 4 other phenomena which are often called hauntings. One is based on energy or energy flow. It's a problem which is more common in the West than in the East, as those cultures in the East tend to have figured out how to avoid the issue by doing what is called feng shui by some. If qi or energy isn't allowed to flow easily through the arrangement of objects in a building, then negative energy can build up in certain rooms. This, in extreme cases, can make people feel uncomfortable and frightened. In even worse instances, the negative energy which results from this can attract very negative and dangerous spirit beings, which then cause their own problems. Because of this, there are much fewer hauntings in Asian countries and cultures than in the West, unless you count replay hauntings and electromagnetic distress. The next cause of hauntings is what people generally perceive a haunting to be. Someone who has passed on from their physical state to their etheric state doesn't want to move on, for whatever reason, and they decide to stick around, often giving physical people a hard time. Sometimes, however, they can be very helpful and kind. Theaters often tend to house these types of friendly etheric people, as many actors have a strong love for theater, and decide to stay to watch shows and even sometimes give actors some sort of advice or harass them if they feel they could do better. Another cause of hauntings is the result of an occult practitioner who has not taken proper precautions in banishing spirits and spiritual forces after they have performed a magical working. This can lead to an opening of sorts, which can invite all sorts of spirits in and act as a portal to lower negative realms and energies. As I mentioned before, messing around with a Ouija board can cause this. The final cause of hauntings is the one which is the most frightening and hard to believe, but it's something my spirits insist upon, and also something which I have come to see actually makes a whole lot of sense given the evidence. In the last episode, I mentioned how there is a category of non-physical being which is very enigmatic and difficult to describe, which I am forced to refer to simply as others. They are not human people who have died, nor are they common astral beings. Well, sometimes one of these others takes a liking to a house or a cabin, almost always in a secluded area. Many types of these others prefer to live away from concentrations of humanity out in the forests, mountains, and deserts. When a particularly nasty one of these others takes a liking to a human dwelling, they become very territorial when people move into it. Since these beings cannot normally be seen or heard by people, as they exist on a different level of being, they do everything they can to make the people aware of their presence and afraid of them, often forcing the people to leave. These types of hauntings tend to be extremely volatile and terrifying, more so than those caused by human etheric people. People who experience very powerful poltergeist phenomenon, loud screaming, horrible smells like the stench of decaying flesh, and particularly mortifying apparitions, which tend to appear more solid than replay apparitions. These apparitions often take the form of decaying human bodies. Many people who have dealt with these countryside hauntings find themselves facing what today would be perceived as, well, a zombie. They then often attribute it to being the spirit of someone who had died there, though it is not. One woman in a secluded house in the country said that she felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to find no one there. When she looked down, however, she saw a sheep looking up at her with a human head, which was decayed horribly. Needless to say, she was very frightened. Which was the point. In the reading section coming up next, the selections I read will have a lower sound quality than the rest of the podcast because I recorded them before I upgraded my recording equipment. So once again, it will sound like I'm reading them in an empty, haunted library.
He was abducted by aliens earlier this afternoon. That little girl got lost under the bed and she went into an alternate dimension.
This article is from disinfo.com, and the title is Scientists Get a Taste of the Transcendent. It was posted by someone called Drockhole, Drokhole, and it was posted on September 1st, 2013. What has been generally termed a mystical experience is something that has been reported throughout time and across disparate cultures. At its core, it's a direct nonverbal experience wherein an individual feels an expansion of the self into a union with, to borrow a phrase from Alan Watts, the whole works. Themes of euphoria, harmonization, and interconnectedness are commonly relayed, along with the ultimate ineffability of it all. Religions and the sciences have blah, blah, blah. I'm preaching to the choir here, so let's get to the goods. Found this gem tucked away in the corners of the web and figured it deserved its day in the sun. It's called the Archives of Scientists' Transcendent Experiences, or TASTE, T-A-S-T-E. And it's a site where scientists themselves were allowed and encouraged to submit their own experiences of non-ordinary states of consciousness. Its mission statement reads, The Archives of Scientists' Transcendent Experiences is an online journal devoted to transcendent experiences that scientists have reported. It lets scientists express these experiences in a safe place, collects and shares them to debunk the stereotype that quote-unquote real scientists don't have spiritual or mystical or psychic experiences, builds a database of these experiences for future research, and helps us understand the full range of the human mind. Unfortunately, the site ceased taking submissions around 2004 and has been inactive ever since. Would be nice if there were a bare-bones database like it around today for scientists to freely and openly share such experiences. Something with maybe a higher profile that might help lift the stigma in the sciences from admitting and exploring this world of experience. Now, all of the accounts featured at that TASTE site are of the spontaneous variety, but as most here are well aware, something of the same nature can seemingly be facilitated through the safe and/or guided use of psychedelics, as this congenial British gent could attest. Anyway, while there are a variety of experiences reported, and I recommend reading through them all, I'm drawn to the instances of cosmic consciousness, or whatever other name one prefers. As such, my favorite comes from Alan Smith, who was a medical doctor and self-described atheistic materialist at the time of the occurrence. My experience of cosmic consciousness. My cosmic consciousness event occurred unexpectedly while I was alone one evening and was watching a particularly beautiful sunset. I was sitting in an easy chair placed next to floor-to-ceiling windows that faced northwest. The sun was above the horizon and was partially veiled by scattered clouds. so that it was not uncomfortably bright. I had not used any marijuana for about a week previously. On the previous evening, I probably had wine with dinner. I do not remember the quantity, but 2 glasses would have been typical. Thus, we would not have expected any residual drug effects. The cosmic consciousness experience began with some mild tingling in the perineal area, the region between the genitals and anus. The feeling was unusual, but was neither particularly pleasant nor unpleasant. After the initial few minutes, I either ceased to notice the tingling or did not remember it. I then noticed that the level of light in the room, as well as that of the sky outside, seemed to be increasing slowly. The light seemed to be coming from everywhere, not only from the waning sun. In fact, the sun itself did not give off a strong glare. The light gave the air a bright, thickened quality that slightly obscured perception rather than sharpened it. It soon became extremely bright, but the light was not in the least unpleasant. Along with the light came an alteration in mood. I began to feel very good, then better still, then elated. While this was happening, the passage of time seemed to become slower and slower. The brightness, mood elevation, and time slowing all progressed together. It is difficult to estimate the time period over which these changes occurred, since the sense of time was itself affected. However, there was a feeling of continuous change rather than a discrete jump or jumps to a new state. Eventually, the sense of time passing stopped entirely. It is difficult to describe this feeling, but perhaps it would be better to say that there was no time, or no sense of time. Only the present moment existed. My elation proceeded to an ecstatic state, the intensity of which I had never even imagined could be possible. The white light around me merged with the reddish light of the sunset to become one, all-enveloping, intense, undifferentiated light field. Perception of other things faded. Again, the changes seemed to be continuous. At this point, I merged with the light, and everything, including myself, became one unified whole. There was no separation between myself and the rest of the universe. In fact, to say that there was a universe, a self, or anything would be misleading. It would be an equally correct description to say that there was nothing as to say that there was everything. To say that subject merged with object might be almost adequate as a description of the entrance into cosmic consciousness, but during this there was neither subject nor object. All words or discursive thinking had stopped, and there was no sense of an observer to comment or to categorize what was happening. In fact, there were no discrete events to happen, just a timeless unitary state of being. Cosmic consciousness is impossible to describe, partly because describing involves words, and it was a state in which there were no words. My attempts at description here originated from reflecting on cosmic consciousness soon after it had passed, and while there was still some taste of the event remaining. Perhaps the most significant element of cosmic consciousness was the absolute knowingness that it involved. This knowingness is a deep understanding that occurs without words. I was certain that the universe was one whole, and that it was benign and loving at its ground. Buck's experience was similar. He knew, quote, that the universe is so built and ordered that without any peradventure all things work together for the good of each and all, that the foundation principle of the world is what we call love, and that the happiness of everyone is in the long run absolutely certain. Unquote. The benign nature and ground of being with which I was united was God. However, there is little relation between my experience of God as ground of being and the anthropomorphic God of the Bible. That God is separate from the world and has many human characteristics. Quote unquote, He demonstrates love, anger, and vengeance, makes demands, gives rewards, punishes, forgives, etc. God, as experienced in cosmic consciousness, is the very ground or beingness of the universe and has no human characteristics in the usual sense of the word. The universe could no more be separate from God than my body could be separate from its cells. Moreover, the only emotion that I would associate with God is love, but it would be more accurate to say that God is love than God is loving. Again, even characterizing God as love and the ground of being is only a metaphor, but it is the best that I can do to describe an indescribable experience. The knowingness of cosmic consciousness permanently convinced me about the true nature of the universe. However, it did not answer many of the questions that, quite rightly, seem so important to us in our usual states of consciousness. From the perspective of cosmic consciousness, questions like what is the purpose of life, or is there an afterlife, are not answered because they are not relevant. That is, during cosmic consciousness, ontological questions are fully answered by one state of being, and verbal questions are not to the point. Eventually, the cosmic consciousness faded. The time changes, light, and mood elevation passed off. When I was able to think again, the sun had set, and I estimate that the event must have lasted about 20 minutes. Immediately following return to usual consciousness, I cried uncontrollably for about a half hour. I cried both joy and sadness because I knew that my life would never be the same. That's the end of Smith's account. Each submission or account is prefaced with some background on the subject, including a name or pseudonym and their scientific training/credentials. Most, like Smith, didn't have an inkling of the quote-unquote spiritual in their body beforehand, and some were actively hostile to the idea altogether. Their subsequent experiences aren't all as intense in degree as Smith's, but they each shine in their own right. With that said, here's a sampling from a few others. Cosmic consciousness experience at age 16. I was listening to the music and looking through the open window at a tree in the garden when something strange happened. I felt that I had left my body and had become one with the tree in the garden, with the pebbles on the garden paths, and with everything else in the universe. I felt some mild amusement seeing my body sitting there in the living room. I had a feeling of indescribable bliss, a feeling that everything was, is, and forever will be as it should be, and could not be any other way, and that time did not pass, that the future was contained in the past, and the past contained in the future, and there was only one time present. Next one is titled Falling Awake. One night, as I was falling asleep, my mind suddenly stopped its ceaseless activity and became still. It was as if it had turned inward and collapsed unto itself. I felt a soft effusion of supreme comfortableness engulf my being, and my mind was for a moment unbounded with no thoughts or perceptions. I was filled with a profound feeling of well-being and happiness. I felt wrapped in a blanket of love and safety, or rather I was that, the wrapper, and the wrapped all at once. There was no differentiation of experience. I was that state, nothing else. It was not me experiencing something outside of me. It was not happiness about any particular thing, but an unconditional, all-pervading bliss that depends on nothing outside of itself. It was as if the river of ever-active consciousness, moving in streams of thoughts and perceptions, had arrived at the ocean of silent, ever-full, unbounded awareness. Expansion of self in the Antarctic. My mind was totally blank. After a while, I realized that I had expanded. I was no longer a small discrete consciousness located in my head. I encompassed the whole valley. I was huge. I was part of everything, or rather everything was part of me. I was ancient and unbelievably powerful. It was wonderful. A taste of Kensho. This totally new view of things can't be conveyed. It is too extraordinary. No conceptual framework, no words exist to describe the depths and the qualities of these insights. Only someone who went through the same experience can understand. The darkness of God. I'm not trying to push any particular theological or metaphysical conclusions when I use the word God here. On the contrary, my readings in theology and metaphysics in early years never conjured up to my mind anything remotely like this experience. I'm simply saying that since the experience, Vaughn's line and a whole host of other statements made by mystics in all religious traditions seem to make sense as word-straining attempts to describe the strange state in which I found myself.
Time has come to see the world as it is.
Typepad.com/paranormalia. Things You Can Do When You're Dead by Robert McLuhan, posted September 3rd, 2013. Tricia Robertson is a paranormal investigator in Glasgow, a recent president of the Scottish Society for Psychical Research. She has been involved in a number of investigations and some years ago co-authored a much-praised research study into mediums. I met Tricia a year or so ago when she invited me to talk to the SSPR in Glasgow. It was a pleasant trip, and she had some interesting tales to tell. Now she has published a book titled Things You Can Do When You're Dead. A cool title, although not, as I first thought, about what dead people do in their new existence, but rather about them communicating with the living, as the subtitle actually makes clear. It's a good read by someone who really knows her stuff. She starts with a startling case of the crisis apparition type. A retired Navy pilot named Bob is returning from a foreign trip and arrives at Glasgow Airport expecting a friend to pick him up. There's no sign of the friend, but he catches sight of another pilot, a man 20 years younger named Jack, whom he used to know well when they flew on the same airline. Jack is coming towards him, grinning. They exchange pleasantries, and then he rushes off to catch a plane. The following day, Bob sees an obituary in a newspaper about Jack, who had appeared died after an illness in an Edinburgh hospital 2 days before the meeting. It fell to Tricia to investigate the case, and she contacted the head of security at Glasgow Airport. The security videotape had already been wiped and reused, but there was some interesting information in the flight schedule. Upon checking airplane timetables for that day, we discovered that there was a flight to Jack's small hometown at 3 p.m. on the day in question, and the checkout desk for that flight was the end desk which Bob saw his friend running towards. It is worth noting again that Bob checked his watch at 2:45 p.m. The chief of security also established subsequently that the coffin of an airline pilot was transported through Glasgow Airport about that time and certainly on that day, having been already transferred from Edinburgh. Although we cannot pinpoint the exact time of this coffin transfer, we know for certain that it was loaded onto an aircraft bound for Jack's hometown destination on that day. One possible answer to this mystery would have been if Jack had a twin brother or a brother who looked exactly like him, and who also knew Bob, but he did not. No other person with even the same surname was on board that 3 o'clock flight. The pilot, an atheist with no interest or belief in such matters, was deeply shaken by the incident. There are other cases of ghosts and apparitions, followed by cases of the poltergeist type that Tricia investigated. A professional couple built a conservatory in which weird things start happening. A pungent and pervasive smell of tobacco, doors and windows repeatedly found open, and anomalous movements of objects. While showing a friend round, the house owner points out a heavy straw model of a Viking ship on a shelf. As they look up, one of the straw paddles very slowly detached itself from the vessel, rose up about 2 inches, and traveled halfway across the room horizontally before it gently floated to the floor in a deliberate zigzag manner. Even a feather would have traveled faster. Investigating the case, Trisha learned that the couple had a friend who used to visit often, but they made him smoke his pipe outside. They promised that when the new conservatory was built, he could smoke in it, but he got ill and died before that happened. The tobacco smoke is a giveaway. It's natural to suppose, assuming survival to be a reality, that the friend had dropped in to say hello and to convey the fact that his still being around, so to speak. That seems dimly to have occurred to the couple as a possibility, but they found it very hard to accept. Trisha says the idea of it made the woman hysterical. Trisha describes a number of other cases that anyone familiar with the poltergeist literature will recognize, mostly seeming to be caused by discarnates, friendly or otherwise. One that was investigated by her colleague Archie Roy in the 1970s involved very disruptive activity over an extended period. At one point, it seemed as if someone with an enormous sledgehammer was taking it and hammering it against the side of the house to such an extent that the whole house shook, a blow coming every 5 seconds or so, hour after hour, till in desperation one would say, "Oh, stop it!" and it would stop. For a while. On one occasion, after a long interval of blessed silence, Max said, "I believe we'll get to the bottom of this." Immediately, there was a sustained banging as if to say, "Oh, no, you won't." There's quite a bit on mediums, including a drop-in type case of a company director who died in a car accident, but was able to communicate to a colleague in a dream the presence of important papers in the wrecked car. These were eventually found sandwiched between the crushed metal. The materials filled out here and there with classic cases from the archives, such as the famous R101 episode involving Eileen Garrett. There is also a chapter about healers named Gary Mannion and Nina Nolan, with some striking examples, and one on past life memory cases. This includes the young Glaswegian boy named Cameron, who talked about a previous life on the island of Barra. Cameron used to speak to his brother about Barra constantly, so much so that the brother would yell in despair, "Goni, shut up about Barra!" He used to say to Norma, his mother, "You've only got one toilet in this house, in Barra we had 3. He never changed his story. He said to Norma, "You would like my Barra, Mum. She's nice, and we could go and see her." He said it with such affection. He spoke about living in a white house and being able to see the beach from his bedroom window as it looked onto the beach, and that the sheep used to come up to the front door of the house. He said that there were boxes outside the house where he thought that fish was kept. He gave details of the family group. He had 3 brothers and 3 sisters. They were allowed to go and play on the beach on their own, but I had to have someone with me. He spoke about playing with a black and white dog and often referred to a big black car and the fact that there were always plenty of children around to play with. He never referred to his own name, but said that his father was called Shane, and said that his father had stepped out onto a road and was knocked down by a car. He also said that he was with him when this happened. We have no information of this, if this happened at Barra Glasgow or elsewhere. When Norma asked him about his mother's name, he replied, "She was called Mummy," a response delivered with a kind of scathing look. He enthusiastically told Norma that his Barra mum had long hair down to there, and as he pointed to below his waist, and then he added, "But she got it cut shorter." He kept saying, "You'll like her, Mum, when you see her. When we go to Barra, please can we go? You'll like her." The family did nothing for some time, but eventually responded to a press advert appealing for parents in this situation to come forward. The outcome was a TV documentary film in which the family were flown to Barra. The house that Cameron claimed to have lived in was identified and many of the details verified. Reading the book, I was struck yet again by the gulf that exists between, on the one hand, the science that tells us such things do not happen, and on the other, the findings of investigators that suggest they actually happen rather often, and more than most of us probably realize. It's a world away from laboratories equipped with complex and expensive gadgetry supported by massive funding to create exciting new technologies. That science is uncertain when it comes to peering into homes, families, and human relations, where such things typically occur. As we know, if what emerges does not chime with what science understands about the accessible world of matter, it's dismissed as anecdote and fancy. But this is not anecdote in the usual pejorative sense. What we know about it, that part which we can consider at all reliable, comes from investigators like Tricia Robertson, who must travel to the locality, often at some distance, win the trust of the people involved, and corroborate the events as far as is possible. If we continue to regard them as anecdotes, it's only in the sense that they are reports of human experience, stories with characters and incidents, accounts that must first be narrated in order to be accessed at all. From her experiences and research, Tricia has become a robust believer in the survival of consciousness after death. But as a practical investigator, her interest is more in the events themselves than in their spiritual and metaphysical implications. It's natural for readers unfamiliar with such things to wonder whether the people at the center of them may be attention seekers or unbalanced or following some concealed agenda. In her experience, they are ordinary folk to whom something rather disturbing has occurred. They seem mostly confused, as any of us would be, often also anxious and desperate for the problem to go away. Much of our work involves developing trust with people in these situations and providing reassurance. She comments, one thing that we have come to accept is that there is always a reason behind the production of phenomenon. Once you have pinpointed a possible reason, whether it is ongoing or historical, incarnate or discarnate in source, then you can begin to look towards a possible resolution or at least some kind of understanding. Science may not formally recognize the existence of such things, but we're reminded that they happen just the same, and that we have to learn how to deal with them. There's a little quote at the end here from Alan Turing. These disturbing phenomena seem to deny all our usual scientific ideas, how we should like to discredit them. Unfortunately, the statistical evidence, at least for telepathy, is overwhelming. It is very difficult to rearrange one's ideas so as to fit these new facts in.
Science can explain everything if we look hard enough.
Shut up, science bitch.
Now, going back to the etheric parasites I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, since every living physical person has a corresponding etheric body, people can be riddled with these spiritual parasites, just as animals in the physical world can be plagued with parasites like ticks or tapeworms. These parasites can then cause all kinds of havoc with someone's etheric body, which then affects them in the physical world, mostly emotionally. A good friend of mine was once on a DMT trip, and said that he perceived a being of some sort which was inside of him but was trying to hide its presence from him. He said that it mostly resembled a centipede and that it contributed to causing negative attitudes and behaviors in his life. I'm not certain, but that sounds a hell of a lot like these parasites, both in its nature and its appearance. I mentioned how when I was foolish enough to perform energy vampirism on people, this mistake led to me unwittingly pulling a lot of these parasites out of other people and into myself, which led to huge problems for me. I'll get to that situation in another episode. Alright, on the next episode, I plan on talking about the astral planes. And I'll close this episode with a quote attributed to Hassan I Sabah, leader of the legendary Hashashins, or Hashishans. Nothing is true, everything is permitted.
Not only is he like ruining my life, but with all this God shit that he's into, he could be ruining my afterlife.
It's a sort of interdimensional vagina that somehow appears. I can interact with it.
Fabric of the entire universe could be torn apart.
I know my mind is changing.